everybody, welcome back to the next part in my dialing in series. This time it's for HX Stomp, and a request I have had a lot recently is to go back and review and recap and tweak my Stomp template preset that I've had up in CustomTone for quite some time. As a lot of you know, I have a Helix template preset that I use pretty regularly. I created one for Pod Go. I've created one for Stomp as well back when 2.8 came out, but there's a couple tweaks I've made to the Helix one with the 2.9 update, and I wanted to do a quick recap and kind of make those same updates to our Stomp template. So it's been something a lot of folks have asked me for, so I figured I would do that. It's not going to be a huge difference from 2.8, but a couple small changes that are important or actually one small change that's really important that came to my attention when I was working with 2.9. So let's dive over to HX Edit. So here I have my Stomp hooked up, and this is what my original template looked like for 2.8. Now the big change there, to recap, was that I wasn't using the old split crossover technique, which was my kind of clumsy workaround for the fact that we didn't have shelf EQs in the Stomp or the Helix. Because of that workaround that I came up with, the wonderful folks at Line 6 put us shelf EQ in there. And so I replaced the split crossover, which freed up a block, which is really handy for us Stomp users, and I used the shelf EQ. The problem was that the settings weren't exactly quite there yet. So in this update we have them. But let's recap right from sort of the back end here, and we'll move on up. Now, let's take a word about my LA Studio comp at the end. I've talked so much about this and why I put it there and whatnot. Now, the thing is, keep in mind this is a template. This is not designed to just be left as is. This is a template, a starting point. Depending on what your end game is, what your ideals are, what your personal preferences are, these things are going to have to be tweaked. One thing I've said about the compressor a bunch of times is, depending on the amount of signal being fed into it, we're going to have to make adjustments specifically to the peak reduction here. It's quite possible that the compression isn't even kicking in and having much of an effect. Now, the LA Studio comp might color the sound regardless, and that's kind of why I like it at the end anyways. It just acts as kind of a glue, as I've said before. But we are going to have to play with the peak reduction depending on how much signal we're sending into it. If we're really putting an amp in front of it and you know, turning the channel volume up all the way and then boosting the signal in other ways, it's going to hit the front of that compressor harder, and we may have to turn the peak reduction down. I'm always aiming for, you know, 1 to 2 dB of gain reduction just to kiss the sound a little bit and glue it together. I'm not looking for overt compression. So I'm going to start with it. On my last template, I think I had this at 5. I'm putting it up to 6, as I find that that setting kind of makes it a little more likely we're going to get that compression just kicking in. But again, it's really going to depend on what you have feeding into it. So make your adjustments accordingly using your ears and hearing if we're getting some gain reduction and not just boosting the volume level. One thing you can do is turn the gain here down so that when you turn, or up depending on the situation again, so that when you turn the compressor on and off, it's going to match volume levels, whether it's on and off. Then you can really hear if the compressor is doing anything. Okay, so, but my settings that I start with are going to be 6 on the peak reduction and 5 on the gain. All right, so that brings us over to the low and high shelf EQ, and this is going to be the big change here now. When I did the split crossover technique, which if any of you don't know what it was, I would use a split path, such as, you know, if I was to pull this down here, just as an example, and we go over to our split paths, I would use the split crossover path, and I would set 650 Hertz as my center point. Obviously, I'm not going to do that with a reverb. That wouldn't make any sense. But what I did do it with was 2 gain blocks, and then it would allow me to take all the frequencies above my center point and boost them with the gain block, and all the frequencies below the center point and boost or cut. Boost or cut, actually, not just boost, right? So that was a bit of a clumsy way to work around it. And so when the folks, Line 6, brought in the low and high shelf EQ in 2.8, that was amazing. Now, the only problem is that the high frequency for the high shelf would only go as low as 2 kilohertz. And I used to find for most of my presets, I liked to have that center point at 650 hertz on both the low and high shelf, so I could boost everything above that and cut everything below it, which was usually what happened. Sometimes I would cut above it, sometimes I would boost below it, sometimes I would move that frequency around, but I want to have that flexibility. So for the template, the setting that I find just kind of works with most amps is if we have the low frequency at 650 Hertz, which I had in the last template, but my hands were tied with the high frequency. I could only go as low as 2 kilohertz. While it did an okay job, it was just missing a little subtle something. So what I'm going to do in this template is roll the high frequency back to 650 Hertz. And what I do is I cut everything below 650 Hertz by 2 dB, and I boost everything above it by 2 dB, okay? Again, this is going to have to be adjusted per preset or for what your final ideals are going to be and what your final outcome wants to be, right? And even just personal preference. Everybody is going to feel differently about this. But I find that with those settings, it just adds a little bit of sparkle on top and it pulls a little bit of the low-end muddiness out of most amp models. And it just kind of, I always call it like the betterizer block, right? And it just kind of makes everything a little more polished sounding to my ears. But again, you can go a little more on the high gain, a little less, or whatever suits your ideals. Now reverb, a lot of folks say, well, I don't really like reverb or I don't use reverb. And you know, I don't use reverb in this situation as an overt big sounding reverb that some folks may not want on their sound. The thing we have to remember about recording direct or plugging in direct is that there is no it's a very dry signal. There's no natural ambience on the signal, right? If I put a microphone in front of a real guitar amp, no matter what room I'm in, the microphone is going to pick up some sort of room sound, just something, right? And it's going to just add to that, that overall tonality or the overall tone of what we're getting. It's going to give it some life, let's say, right? You know, how else can you describe it? So when we record direct out of the Stomp or the Helix or the Pod Go, it's going to be bone dry. We don't get any of that natural ambience. So I like to put a little room reverb on with the decay at 4.5 and the mix at 30%. Everything else I just kind of leave alone. And that just kind of brings it to life a little bit and gives it more of the sense of it, the sound sitting in a real space. And that's why I put that there. And then I'm a bit of a sucker for delay. I love the transistor tape, and therefore I've put that on as well. We can turn that on or off depending on whether we want delay. If we want a bit of delay on a lead sound, then it's here and it's ready to go. My normal settings are feedback at 23%. I always change it to note sync so it's tied to the tempo up here. I usually set it to a quarter note, but again, this can all change depending on the situation. This is just so I can load this up and have something that's in the ballpark right away and get off to the races, and then I can tweak as I go along, right? The scale's at 100%, the mix is at 25%. These are all stereo blocks, but there's nothing really ridiculously stereo sounding about them. If we wanted to change that, then we could move our scale control around and wow and flutter up and spread up and whatnot, you know, and I've talked about that a bunch in other videos. So that gets us going, and that leaves us with 2 more blocks for now that we could throw in there. Now, so with the amp and the cab, a lot of folks might say the difference between this and the Helix is that I have a parametric EQ in my Helix template. Now, the parametric EQ is where I usually do my high and low cuts, and it also allows me the ability that if I want to tweak the EQ a bit, I can, but I'm not going to eat up a block for that here. I'm going to be able to get what I need 90% of the time out of the high and low shelf EQ. And the beautiful part as of 2.8 is when we add an amp and cab, and I'll just pick something here to throw it in there. Let's go with the solo lead crunch. When I throw that in there, the amp and the cab block, if I go over to the cab block, as of 2.8, the low cut is set to 80 and the high cut is set to 8 kilohertz automatically. Okay, so that kind of takes care of it. And those are pretty good settings. I think the folks at Line 6 did a good job kind of picking those points for low and high cuts. So as soon as we add in, we don't have to worry about the low and high cuts. It's going to be added in automatically. And obviously we could change that as well. I'm just going to take this though, and I'm going to throw on a 160 ribbon just because I really like ribbon mics, as you all know. And okay, let's turn off all of our blocks that we put in there. I'm going to make sure that I've got some decent signal coming in. I'll just crank the channel volume. We'll see what we got. This is by just loading up the solo lead crunch and changing it to ribbon mic. Nothing wrong with that, sounds nice. You'll see if I do go back here though, and go back to the 57 dynamic 1-inch back, how much of a difference it makes. Again, if I go up to the 160 ribbon, so it just kind of, it does make it a little bit muddier, but there's something nice in the smoothness of the ribbon mic. But then when we add in our other elements from our template, it's going to kind of take care of that for us. So let's bring in our compressor and see what that does to it. Here it is off. So very subtle, but it adds a nice just squishiness to the sound. Now, this is the block that I'm going to find really does something nice to the sound automatically. And just like I said, it kind of makes it, it's a betterizer plug, you know? Here in the bottom end especially, there's a little bit of mud when that's off. Turn that on. Kind of cleans that up nicely. So then we can come in and add that touch of reverb. And if we so desire, a dab of delay. And that's our tone, right? So again, if I turn all of those off, here's our tone. Everything on. And it just sounds so much nicer, I find, and it just kind of polishes everything and gets it working nicely. We could try this with almost any other amp as well. I don't know, let's pick the new Rev Gen Purple. And again, what I'm gonna do is, we have a, I really love the Greenback 25 cabinet with this amp for some reason. I'll put the 160 ribbon 4 inches back again. Let's turn everything off here. And here's what that would sound like without any of the processing. Very different tone. Let's bring all of this in. If I turn the delay off, let's just try without the low and high shelf. A little bit of a tuning thing going on there. Anyways, that's what those settings do. So I'm gonna have this up on CustomTone and you guys can grab it. It's going to have the new little tweaks to it and I'll label it Template Stomp 2.9. And that's basically how I would go about creating a template. Obviously our hands are tied a little bit compared to the Helix simply because we have less blocks to work with. And as of 3.0 though, apparently we should have 8 blocks coming, which is going to be a nice thing, which is the word out there. So awesome stuff. Hope you guys enjoy that. Thank you so much for tuning in as usual. Please like the video, share it with anybody who you might think would get use out of it, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit the little bell notification so you get notified when I put new videos out. And I'll be back soon with some more content. Thank you guys again for your time, and thanks for your support, and thanks for tuning in. I will be back soon. Ciao for now.